which actually, and I want to just give another pause just to see, because that was a great question. Just it goes into another side that I wanted us to make sure we thought about, and it's about the narratives that come into play that leaders and managers will have to think about how they're going to reconcile with this stuff in order to really try to dismantle race-based oppression. All right. And hopefully people also know that they can reach out to us if they need support when you're reading these, and to also know that you don't have to know everything at one time either. Okay. So when we think about the fact that we don't want to just have this dominant identity that is brought up, I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. And I also want to let you know that when I start talking about it, you will get uncomfortable. Okay. It will be very uncomfortable. So just preface that, do whatever you need to do, take a drink of water, things like that. Because it will be uncomfortable. We want to calm ourselves down. But it's about the narratives that come up, right? So in our world, there's messages that we've heard, there's stories that we've heard, and then it creates these narratives, right? And then that is what then starts to help us to where we form our values and our worldview. So I was raised a Seventh-day Adventist, so I heard all these stories about the Sabbath and keep the Sabbath day and the 10 Commandments, and I heard all of these messages and stories that created a narrative for me, which then filtered into my values and worldviews. Now that's something from religion. I want you to start thinking about the things, the messages, the stories that we've heard all our lives. You might not even know where it came from. That created these narratives that then created values and worldviews. Now, one of the things that have come up since our group has been going through this is I shared that my daughter let me back up. Messages and stories about hair. What are some messages and stories about hair that we've heard? What is good hair? What is pretty hair? Right? Is it typically curly? No, typically straight or short, and very, very tailored and very pristine in a very concrete way, right? Like those are stories that we tell. And so then the narrative becomes that in order to be presentable, in order to be professional, your hair needs to look this way. Then it becomes a part of people's values and how they see the world, which also impacts how we see other people. So I always like to ask people, when you think about your worldview, do you think you have a European and Eurocentric worldview? Yes? No? Depends on the day of the week? I would want to say no, but I know that's not true. So I'm going to say it depends on the day of the week, because I was socialized in the United States. So all the messages, all the stories that filter into my values and worldview have come from a very US-centered, Eurocentric ideal. Now, some of those ideals, I don't want to say they're bad or worse or different, but it does impact the way that we show up. So I'm just going to share a couple of ways that people have been able to describe what European worldviews look like. And I'm going to compare or contrast them with an African worldview. So even though I am Black, I am a Black descendant of enslaved Africans, Nigerian to be exact. So I would say that my ethnicity, I'm African American. So that's why I'm choosing to use African worldviews. But for people with other ethnicities that are not European, most people will say this feels very consistent with indigenous nations, other parts of the world that aren't Eurocentric or prior to colonialization. Let me also add that part. most people, they'll say it resonates with them. So, for example, some big ones, and I'm just going to run through them. I know this print is small, but the highest value of life lies within an object or in the acquisition of an object, right? So everything is about what can you get, what can I obtain. We're trying to get to the whatever, the gold medal. I get. We're just trying to get stuff, right? Trying to accumulate stuff. Whereas in an African worldview, the central tendency is that the actual highest value is our interpersonal relationships with each other. So when we think about the work that we do as leaders and managers, we have to think about how much of the messages and stories and narratives have guided us to say, we need to get more, we need to get more, we need to get more. And that supersedes our relationships with people, right? A person gains knowledge through counting and measuring and quantifying. And those are the only ways we can share information. No shade to Jess in our evaluation team that does great evaluation in different ways, but we also know that's not the only way, right? It's not the only way, because in other ways, if people talk about symbolic imagery and learning through music and rhythm and how that is just a core part of how people can learn and exchange information. Other things, one, control and dominate nature, where in African worldviews is that people should live in harmony with nature, that nature should be uplifted, supported, held, right? One example that I know I use European worldviews with this is that I don't like to go outside that much. Well, I didn't used to like to go outside at all. I don't like bugs. I don't like dirt. I don't like trees. I don't like grass. I just have not wanted to do that. So if it were up to me, I would have my backyard be a whole slate of concrete. Now, many of you know that that's not good for the earth. That's good for the earth, right? And so I've started to, once I've realized, like, Aisha, you're getting away from some of the values because you're paying attention to these other messages. I'm like, okay, I need to become more one with nature, embrace it, let my hair get wet, let these things happen. A couple other things: survival of the fittest upholds the most importance, whereas in an African worldview, it's the survival of the group holds the utmost importance. So I know a lot of our metrics that we have to use for our work, it does become just like who can do it the best. But instead of, we want you to think about, like, instead of maybe what can the team do? So again, these are some, just being able to see the difference between the two. Because now when we think about Eurocentric and European worldviews, this is the slide that people really hate. You ready? Be ready. Be ready. Characteristics of white supremacy culture. Now, I want you all to remember, when I always ask people, the first word that comes to mind when you hear white supremacy is often things like Ku Klux Klan, swastikas. Like, there's a very like rigid idea. But what I want you to think about is those European worldviews that have then become a part of our culture, our values, right? So it's not just white supremacy as white supremacists, but it's that dominant language and that dominant narrative, that dominant worldview that has now become basically the standard for many people. So I'm going to share with you some of them, and I want you to think about which ones you see come up in yourself. Okay. So again, I want you all as managers and leaders to understand this, because when your team is bringing up things that they're telling you are perpetuating a certain type of culture that is not conducive to anti-racism, I need you to be able to be open to hear that. And I also need you to be open to know that none of us are exempt from doing it. So if I go back to that narrative, I started to tell you all about the narrative about straight hair. My daughter went to work, her hair was pulled back in this way, and then the back though was like poofy. Kind of like what Lizzie's hair looks like in her profile picture. It's like, curly, but it's big. And her supervisor sent her home and said, your hair is not professional. And she literally told her, you either need to go get your hair braided or you need to go straighten it. This person was a Black woman. In that Black woman's mind, that was unprofessional. So it is not just these narratives and values and worldviews are not solely perpetuated by people based on their race. It has much more to do about how you've been socialized. Right. And many of you have heard me tell stories about things like when I tell people my name is Daicia, people automatically will assume one thing or have a difficult time pronouncing it. I know there's people that are like that are Black that have said, I'm not going to name my child one of those names because I don't want people to think this. We all do it. We all do it in different ways. If you've been socialized here, I want to be clear. Like if you've been socialized here, it's very likely that you're doing some of those things. And it's a part of our culture that we need to disrupt. And I need managers and leaders to support your whole team in thinking about how to disrupt them. So here are the list of white supremacy culture things, and everyone will have the option to be able to read this article. I do sometimes call it dominant culture, but to honor what the authors use, the name of the article is The Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture. And so they talk about perfectionism, sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, worship of the written word, either or thinking, power hoarding, fear of open conflict, individualism, progress is bigger, more, objectivity, paternalism, and right to comfort. Okay, so when we're talking about being anti-racist and dismantling something, we literally have to do something different, right? We have to do something different. We have to replace it with something. We got to think about that in a real way. So as you hear these things, I want you to think about how this shows up, not just in yourself, but you all know I love to tell you to think about it in yourself first. But think about how does it show up in yourself, in the organization, and then how does it show up in supervision, right? How do things like perfectionism show up? Are we intolerable about mistakes that our staff makes? Are we punitive when they make these mistakes? Right? There's no room for error. I actually had a boss say that to me before. There's no room for error here. Sense of urgency. Do it now, right this moment. We only have 2 minutes to do this. You only have 1 week to turn this around. Defensiveness. Well, it's not me. I didn't make the rules. So I don't know why you asked me. It's not my fault. We didn't say it was your fault, but we know we need to change it. Right? Quantity over quality. Even in this moment, oh, we didn't get enough people. I don't care if I get one person. If you get it and it changes the way you do one thing, that's the quality. Right? We don't want to just look at at quantity and worship of the written word. Oh, if it's not written down, it doesn't happen. I had a dream last night that I went to a training and forgot to sign in, and they were like, well, if you didn't sign in, you weren't here. And I'm like, you and they just kept saying, if it's not on the paper, it's not on the paper. If it's down on the paper, it doesn't count. And I was like, oh. Now, this, even as I'm saying these things, I want to remind us that we can't get stuck in either or thinking. I recognize the need to also look at numbers, but not over the quality. We do want to do our best job, but not to just think everybody has to be perfect. There are times where we have to act in haste, but to just always live with a sense of urgency is not helpful. So when I'm saying these things, please remember, if we're starting to get into an either or thinking, then we're just doing another characteristic. right? Power hoarding. So that can look two different ways. I tell people all the time, it can either be a leader or someone um, pushing themselves in power and not allowing people to have power. But that also looks like people in different positions feeling like they don't have any control and they can't say anything. So then they kind of perpetuate this power hoarding thing. It's like, well, that's the manager's job. I don't know. That's above my pay grade. That means you're allowing the power hoarding to happen. Now, some people say it's the manager's responsibility or not my responsibility because they have a fear of open conflict and they don't want to share to their superiors. Well, this I have a concern about what you said. We have to stop that because it's not helpful, right? Individualism, we want to move from that, try to be more group oriented. But we know, what is that? Work by yourself. Are you able to be? Some people's evaluations say, are you able to take initiative and be a self starter? Are you able to work independently? And if you say no, some people think that that's a defect. That's a characteristic of white supremacy culture, right? Progress has to be big or more. Objectivity. We think there's only one right way, right? We see all of the ways that this happens in our work. Paternalism, only the boss can say what's going to happen without engaging other people. And they have to make decisions for you instead of people being able to be empowered to make decisions based on what works for them. And then lastly, that right to comfort. So we want to name these things, but what's more important than naming them is actually thinking about things we can do to disrupt it. And so I shared some of those things just by talking about them, but I do just want to go through them. And the article has what they call antidotes to say, how do we stop this? Right? Because it happens. I'm a perfectionist. Oftentimes I beat myself up. I tell people I'm my worst critic. And I'm just like, I can't believe I messed that up. I can't believe I did that. Well, I need to have a different type of culture that fosters appreciation for trying, right? That we're trying to say, what do we do? Everything that we do is appreciated. We are thinking about what did we learn from it? What are learning moments? I try to not ask my students anymore or staff that I supervise, what I don't even say I always say, what did you learn? What are opportunities to grow? Instead of like, what mistakes did you make? Where did you mess up? I try to say, where are opportunities to grow? I don't even like to say what you didn't do well. Sometimes I think, what do you think we could do differently? That's what I try to say. What could we do differently? What did we learn from this? Because doing things different, we always learn something new, right? That's an ongoing process, having a growth mindset, but we don't want to make it be as though there's just one way either. And so when offering feedback, giving balanced feedback to make sure that when we are also giving criticism and critiques, that we also offer a suggestion. So that goes to our agreement, accountability, respect, and support. Don't just say, I don't like that you did that. Right. So I'm the first one to tell people, I don't like when people ask me, Dearborn, when I say I work at U of M, and since Tracy picked up her cup, that made me think of this. When I say I work at U of M in School of Social Work, and they say, oh, which campus, Dearborn or Flint? And so I've tried to help people to understand how that's offensive. One, there's multiple campuses. Two, the only school of social work is only located in Ann Arbor. But in order to give people some feedback, right? So I can critique it and say, I don't like it when you do that. But now what I tell people is say, if you really want to know what campus people work in, just ask which campus. If you really don't know, just say which campus. Don't pick out one or two of them. And don't even say Ann Arbor, because a lot of times if you're white, people will automatically say, oh, you work at Ann Arbor, right? And then it's like, no, I don't work at Ann Arbor, actually. And so, I mean, why did you think I worked there? Who wants to work there? That place is, I digress. But it's so that's how I offer the suggestion, because I'm recognizing that obviously you don't know what to do. And I'm not saying I'm not expecting you to be perfect. The sense of urgency, start thinking about realistic work plans. I know that some of you all are thinking right now, that is above my pay grade. you all need to go talk to the state. We're talking about this every single place somebody will listen. Because I know when I did direct service, and the first time somebody asked me, and this was a long time ago, so I know it's worse now, when somebody said, okay, you're going to have a caseload of 70 families. And I said, I work 37 and a half hours. Can somebody make that mathematical equation make sense to me? And as the young people say now, the math ain't mathing. 70 families, 37 and there's no way, I don't care what you do. There's no way I can do that and do documentation and have healthy boundaries and be able to support. There's no way that happens, right? Doing a 30-page assessment in 2 hours, that is not realistic. And we have gotten to this place where we just say we should just be able to do it, instead of really realizing that things actually take much longer than anyone expects. I've shared it before, I'll share it again. The one thing that I have learned to do from this at jobs, that when people had a sense of urgency, is to do time studies. How long does it take you to actually do this? Like with everything. Sending an email, writing a referral, contacting the resources. How long does that really take? And then being mindful of not just taking the person who can do it the quickest, because some of us can do a lot of things really quickly, and that's okay too. But to not make that be the standard. I think that's what they did. I think they said, oh, well, so-and-so was able to do it, so everybody should be able to do it. It's like, no, that doesn't work. So being able to have those things for funding proposals, they need to have realistic timeframes. I love Wayne County. I really do. But sometimes when they do things and they'll give a contract and say, yeah, we want you to do this and you'll get it in March. And can you have all this done by September 30th, please? It's like, no. I can tell you what we can do by September 30th. Oh, I love that this example just came up, because I love to share things that are real, and to let you all know I'm not just talking about this. We actually do these things, right? So when Jess and I remember, we were thinking about proposals, and we said, and we're like, they're asking, but what is the timeline? And we said, I think we need to be really honest with them and say, this is what we can do in that timeline. This is what we cannot do in that timeline. But a lot of people often don't even push back to say that's not realistic. And I think, again, a lot of it comes from either fear or defensiveness, because I'll talk about defensiveness. We need to be this thing to think like, don't be afraid of losing power. Don't be afraid of like, oh, what are people going to think about me if they say this? Do they think that means I'm inadequate? Because they put the expectation out. So obviously they must think people can do it. No, we weren't being defensive about it. We just be clear. And to also say, we could do a lot of things, right? We want to not be defensive, just engage, try to understand, give people credit, also listen to each other, and not just say, well, we could do a whole lot of stuff, but it won't be quality. And that's why even our evaluators on the team, they do look at numbers and things like that, but also but not at the expense of quality. We're not going to do that. Right? So we want to think about, how do we use multiple forms of measurement to see what we've achieved. I keep talking to I think the state of Michigan for sure, and other federal folks that fund workforce development programs have to think more about, did the person get a job? And more about, do you like your job? Are you happy at your job? Does this feel like a job you could do for a long time? Is it sustainable? Does it meet your lifestyles? Does it help your goal? Can you live off of it? Because I could get people, you're right, people can get jobs all day long. But does it match? So thinking more, if we could have more qualitative measurements for the work that we do in workforce development, even, what could that look like? Are people in healthy workplaces? That's a whole nother thing. right? Because they want you to just place people anywhere. And so then it's like, well, that place is not really a healthy environment. You know, some of those places that are work sites that people work in that you're like, yeah, that's a little, well, no, I wouldn't want anybody to work there. I wouldn't want just a dog to work there. And I don't even like dogs. So, so like to that moment. Again, worship of the written word can tie into that. Sometimes employers will say, well, we've done this and we do this, and that's all on their website. But you know that they're engaging in discriminatory practices, or you know that they're not creating healthy workplaces, but because it says that they are. That's not the only thing. We can have things in writing and try to bring in other ideas of things that we can do and allow people to have different ways that they're going to share the information too. So again, we want to focus on what are some ways that we can disrupt these things, because we know what they are. You see them. And so one way this might come up is when one of your staff asks you a question about, can we change something or can we do something different? You're like, well, no, the policy says, well, let's look at the policy again. Is it a good policy? Is it an equitable policy? Because one of the things that we've learned is that most policies, procedures, and laws were not designed for people with marginalized identities. They were not designed for women. They were not designed for people of color. They were not designed for young people or older people. They were not designed for people in the US that are not English speaking. They were not designed for people who don't have any who have any physical, mental, emotional disabilities. They weren't designed for us. They weren't. So there are going to be lots of times where you'll find a policy that is adversely impacting other groups. One perfect example of that is, and I'm sorry if y'all hate my examples, but I love my examples in it. I love them. But one organization that I probably have shared before, because it's my favorite, when they used to require women to wear stockings every day. It was a policy that women were required to wear stockings. And this was a policy all up until 2019, 2020. It was on the books. All women must wear stockings or pantyhose. Yes, it was written. Should it have been? That's a question for another day. For people who don't know what that means, not only is that assigning women to one way of dressing, but it's also extremely expensive. To have to wear pantyhose or stockings every day to work, a pair of stockings on average is about $7 a pair. They can be double that, more than that, and they can be a little lower. But that 7 times 5 is 35. That means you're spending $35 more a week than male employees who don't have the same dress code. So that's just an example of how sometimes there's going to be policies and words that are written that we actually need to go against, maybe. And so then we'll talk about either or thinking. Again, one of the things that I actually do this with my clients now with my team. So when you all are doing team decision making and things like that, and people say, well, we could either do this or we could do that. Say, and give me 2 other options. And my client the other day, she's getting tired of me doing it. She said, I don't have any more. These are the only 2. I said, there's always 2 more. There's always 2 more. And they're like, yeah, give me 2 more. And I said, it doesn't mean you have to follow them. So they can even be silly other alternatives. But there are other alternatives, right? Like they might not even be legal alternatives, but there are other alternatives. There's things you can do. So I want you all to try to push in team meetings, even to, if anybody is wearing 2 ideas, to say we need at least 1 more, and I will push it to 2 more. And then with that should also help with reducing power hoarding, where people are engaged in processes, making sure that people are understanding what the skills are of people on your team and not feeling like one person needs to know all the answers. And creating a space where there can be healthy, open conflict, right? some things to do. That's why a lot of our trainers will do role play. So role playing, well, what do we do when this happens? Being able to be clear about what's the difference between being polite and raising hard issues. Because a lot of people will say to me, I have colleagues, when I hold them accountable with respect and support, they'll say, oh, Daicia was so disrespectful. No, Daicia knows how to be disrespectful. You have not seen disrespectful. It's not disrespectful. I'm being very clear. I'm being very direct. And just because you do not like it does not mean that I'm being disrespectful. So encouraging people to like not mix those things up, and to also respect that there's different ways that people communicate. Right? My communication patterns may look different than someone else's. It doesn't mean they're right or wrong. Okay. So thinking about those things. And then lastly, some anecdotes I wanted to share with you all around paternalism is giving people the opportunity to make choices and be a part of decision making. And I will tell you for sure, even customers will be some customers won't even like this, right? So I used to run a food pantry, and we used to pack everybody's bag for them and give them the bag. And so everybody's bag was the same. And that was practicing paternalism. Like, I'm going to make this bag for you. I'm going to give it to you, and you do it exactly the way that I said. And this is what you get. When we stop doing it that way and say, well, you come in and you get what you need. You pick which corn you want. You pick which carbs you want. You pick which meat you want. And leave the things you don't want. Some people are like, I don't like this. I just tell me what I can do and what I can't do. It's like, nope. You got to be able to make some decisions that meet your needs. So trying those things can be really helpful. And especially as job coaches or working with other customers, like giving them the things to think about, not doing either or, but giving help brainstorming options. Right to comfort, again, making sure that we are mindful that we need that discomfort to grow. And encouraging even our customers to think about what that looks like. Now, I hope that as I'm going through these things, you are realizing that these are literally the same things that we've shared with you all to do when it comes to trauma-informed. This is not anything different than trauma-informed approaches. We talk about collaboration. We talk about safety. We talk about transparency and trustworthiness, making sure people know what's happening, dialogue, peer support. We talk about all of those principles. And now I want you to recognize how those principles are not only trauma-informed, but can also help us to dismantle racism. And if you were at the another Leaders and Anti-Racist work, you probably have also seen these examples that we've shared for you all. But I always think that repetition is good for the soul. But some ways you can do those things is prioritize work flexibility and trust. Right? Things like flexible work hours, giving people opportunities to change their schedules, do things differently, making open statements that support people who have been historically marginalized, having talks with the turmoil in Gaza that has been, people need statements. They want to know they feel safe. Everybody needs to know that they are safe. Having time off for events when things happen, holding spaces for people, for the needs of people who identify as Black, Indigenous, or other people of color, especially Black trans women. Even though I don't want to engage in oppression competition, I do believe that if we created a world that felt safe and inclusive for a Black, trans, older or younger woman that does not speak English as their first language, that is not Christian, that also has a mental and physical disability, that the whole world will be a better place. Because if we create it for her in mind and accessible and inclusive, we all win. We all win. So if you want to do that, if I have to think about who am I trying to create a policy for that's going to be inclusive and be supportive, that's the person I'm going to think about. What kind of needs would they have? Being as focused on checking in as well on well-being as work tasks, allowing for rest both at and away from work. Yeah, I know you all have been doing that. If you can do work at home setups and things like that. And we also had shared an article about how to be an anti-racist supervisor. And one of the things that they talk about is like starting with what you call yourself. Words matter. And I know job titles can look different, but I've really tried to be mindful of like not having this supervisor, overseer kind of approach to the work that I do with people that I have the opportunity to be a leader with. Okay. So again, we always want to remind people that these things are challenging and you have to start with yourself. You just got to. You because it's easy to be like, I'll be like, oh Jess, let me tell you how to be anti-racist. No, I need to figure out how to disrupt this stuff in my own self. Right? How do I have to like Jess didn't text me back? I texted Jess an hour ago and they still didn't text me back. Like Jess, like, did you? Yeah, I did. But like I have to challenge myself about sense of urgency. Like, why do I think someone needs to respond to me right away? Right? Like that's how I have to check myself. So I want you to think about what are some antidotes that you can incorporate for you first as you start to think about it in other spaces. And so we always share resources. So there are different places that we all are at. Some of us are in a fear zone. Some of us are still learning. Some of us are in our growth zone. And we give resources because some of us need to heal from the racial trauma that we've experienced. Some of us need to heal from internalized racism and oppression. So, like the person who sent my daughter home, when I would tell some of my Black students that they were being unprofessional because they did something like that. I don't know if you all caught that, but it's a suck of the tongue thing, and being like, oh, you got an attitude. Oh, you can't get nowhere. That's internalized oppression. When I'm doing it on my own people and to my own self, it's internalized. Then if you're someone who is white, you might want to look at scaffolding anti-racist resources for each of these things. Because for some of us, we're just getting started even being able to talk about it. And others of us are ready to do action. So we have lots of those things. And then organizational wise, one website that I have really appreciated is a place called Racial Equity Tools that bring up different things around to the fundamentals of racial equity, how to plan, how to act, how to evaluate, how to connect things to those. So all of those resources are hyperlinked here for you. And we want you to be able to use them as you after you go through this, and don't just put it on the shelf. Don't just put it on the shelf, and support the people who are engaging in this training. And so lastly, I would just want to share some equity focused principles that are very similar, again, to trauma-informed principles: belonging, transparency, having structured interactions so where everyone can engage. One example, some people don't understand what I mean by that, but it's like making sure that people have access. Actually, you all probably do know about this, because now that I'm thinking about, one of the reasons why we moved to online was to try to support people and not feel like they needed, so it couldn't just be the people that were there already, but like wherever you were, if you didn't have to drive or whatever, because you got to be at a drive, you got to be at a park, you got to be at a walk to go to a meeting. And so some of those things can be like that, but we also want to have some that aren't, right? We don't want everybody to have to, oh, the only time you can advance in your career is by going to happy hour, because that means you have to have access. You can't be a caregiver, right? Of children or adults, right? So thinking about those things, critically engaging difference. We talk about that cultural humility, and flexibility, being responsive and adapting to changing and diverse circumstances. That's what it's going to require. And I know for so many of us, I did not say this, but I want to be clear that a lot of those white supremacy culture things are some of the ways that many of us have become successful. We become successful by being perfectionists and having a sense of urgency and not stopping and working and trying to shoot up numbers and only saying either or and not thinking about anything in between. That's how many of us have made it. So it's going to be difficult to switch this mindset, but we have to, because the world is continuing to struggle. And if we want to support our teams, if we want to support our, and ultimately our customers, we have to create an environment that allows these things to be present. Okay. So we'll also share just some additional resources that you'll have that we have is there's a website called Mindful Anti-Racism. There is a group called Surge Showing Up for Racial Justice that is primarily catered to people who identify as white that want to engage in racial justice work. We have some social work resources. I know that many of you are not necessarily social workers, but it can be really helpful to connect with those, especially for your behavioral health providers. The United Way, Washtenaw and Wayne County have been doing 21 challenges for race. So we've put some link to their previous ones that have some really good challenges and readings in there. And I also, just real quick, I wanted to show where the equity teaching focus things came from. And then we also do offer the certificate in dismantling oppression, which is on there just because of what we've already done. So those are the things, and I think I did it right in time. So questions, thoughts, reactions, and maybe we could even turn the recording off. So if you all who are watching, thank you so much. And then let's personalize it a little bit.